Hi there. My rage at the West's treatment of Ukraine, and in particular Donald Trump's treatment of Ukraine, and the betrayal in which, unfortunately, our governments and others have been guilty of when it comes to Ukraine, have manifested itself into a story which I would implore you to watch if you're interested in the truth, if you're interested in not turning a blind eye to what's still going on in Ukraine. Ukraine Betrayed is a story which I've just completed. It's an audio book, so it's not hard to read because you don't have to read it at all. You just have to listen to it. And for those of you interested, it's the link is in this clip. I hope you listen to it. I think that it's about time we all stopped forgetting and started remembering the promises that were made to Ukraine, and starting to realise who the victims are in this conflict. And it's certainly not Vladimir Putin, Donald Trump, and the Russian sycophants.
Title: Ukraine Betrayed, Ukraine's Struggle, the West's Silence, and the Cost of Abandonment. Author Peter Lamb. This is not just a story, it is a reckoning. It is written not for comfort, but for clarity. Not to reassure, but to awaken. In these pages you will not find neutrality. You will find truth, raw, unvarnished, and carved from the voices of those who are too often reduced to statistics and sound bites. Ukraine is not just a place on a map. It is the battleground between tyranny and liberty, between truth and manipulation, between the future we hope for and the past we swore never to repeat. This story does not seek your applause. It seeks your attention, your outrage, your voice. It speaks of broken treaties and broken trust, of tanks that rolled in while cameras turned away, of promises made in Western capitals, then forgotten. It speaks of Trump, not as a figure of partisan debate, but as a symbol of how moral cowardice, when wrapped in nationalism, can shake the foundations of global solidarity. It calls out the betrayals, the profiteers, the leaders who spoke of justice while enabling its enemies. It asks you, Europe, America, all of us, what our values are worth when they are tested. Because one day, long after this war ends, history will ask not just what happened, but who watched it happen. If you choose to listen, listen fully. Feel the weight of every name, every grave, every child whose only crime was being born in the wrong time under the wrong sky. And ask yourself, did we do enough? This story begins in the dark, but not in silence. The voices are still calling. The question is, are you still listening? In the frosted silence before dawn, the town of Chernihiv stirred under a weight that no citizen of a peaceful world should ever bear. The wind carried the distant rumble of artillery like a ghost of thunder, a cruel reminder that war did not sleep, and neither could its victims. They said the world would stand with us, whispered Natalia, pulling the wool blanket tighter around her shoulders as she stared at the shelter's cracked wall. But where is the world now, Vasil? Vasil didn't answer. Not because he didn't want to, but because he couldn't. The question was too heavy. How could he explain to his daughter that international diplomacy, once promising, had become theater, performative, and hollow? Washington's talking points are louder than their actions, grunted Ivan from the corner. And as for Trump, his love letters to dictators mean more to him than our lives. The room fell quiet. No one disagreed. Even in the dark, the truth shone cruelly clear. Ukraine had been promised solidarity, security, a seat at the table. Instead, it got delays, debates, and a president of the United States more interested in photo ops and cable news segments than international law. Trump praised Putin while our hospitals burned, said Natalia, her voice low but razor sharp. He called NATO obsolete while children lost their mothers in Mariupol. Is that leadership? Is that freedom? Outside, the first rays of sunlight clawed their way over the Dnieper River. A new day. Another one survived, barely. We used to look west and see hope, Vasil finally spoke. Now we look and we see politics, cold, transactional, and late. The world was watching, yes, but often as spectators, not allies. And in the silence of the shelter, that betrayal hurt more than the bombs ever could. But we're still here, Natalia said. And maybe, that's our answer to all of them, that we are still here. Her words didn't erase the pain, but they planted something else. Something more enduring. A flame. While missiles shattered buildings in Kharkiv and families huddled in cellars across the Donbass, a different kind of warfare unfolded in air-conditioned rooms in Washington, Brussels, and Mar-a-Lago. It was a war of narratives, of twisted truths spoken into microphones by men in suits, men untouched by the sting of shrapnel or the wail of grieving mothers. "Do you remember?" Ivan hissed, eyes fixed on the old television flickering in the corner of the shelter. "Do you remember how Trump called Putin a genius while Russian bombs rained down on our schools?" They remembered. The world remembered. But memory alone does not make change. He undermined his own intelligence agencies, said Ukraine had always been corrupt, as if that justified the blood in our streets. Natalia's voice quivered, not from fear, but rage. He made excuses for a tyrant while pretending to champion freedom. It was more than negligence, it was betrayal. Under the Trump administration, American foreign policy became a casino chip in a billionaire's ego game. Allies were bullied, enemies were emboldened, and the international order groaned under the weight of chaos-made policy. 4 years of poison, Vasil muttered. We pleaded for weapons, and they sent us slogans. We cried for support, and they gave us speeches at press conferences. And still Ukraine stood, wounded but unbroken. The spirit of Man, the people's revolution, burned in every act of resistance. Yet every time a Western politician hedged their support, every time a news anchor reduced a massacre to a soundbite, that spirit bled. They talk about us like we're a chessboard, Natalia said, her fists clenched. But we're not pawns, we're people. Beyond the bombed-out apartment blocks, the Kremlin celebrated its chaos campaign. Disinformation, corruption, manufactured doubt, it all worked too well. Troll farms in Moscow spun conspiracy theories embraced by Trump's base. Social media filled with lies dressed in patriotism. The result? A fractured West and a Ukraine left gasping. And now, Vasil whispered, we are expected to be grateful for every bullet, every delay, every conditional promise. In the shadows of betrayal, truth became a form of resistance. Ukraine wasn't asking for charity. It was demanding justice. We will not forget who stood with us, Natalia said, and we will never forget who watched us burn while tweeting love to our killer. War has no mercy for innocence. It rips through playgrounds and picture books with the same brutality it shows to tanks and trenches. And in Ukraine, children learn to count not in numbers, but in sirens, in seconds to shelter, in the days since they last saw their father. He was only 9, Natalia whispered, tracing her finger over the edge of a photograph, creased, smudged, cherished. He knew the difference between a Kaliber cruise missile and a Grad rocket before he knew how to ride a bicycle. Her son, Artem, had once dreamed of becoming an astronaut. Now he flinched at the sound of boiling kettles, slept with his shoes on, and drew pictures of tanks burning because somewhere in his shattered child's logic that made the noise stop. We used to count stars, Vasil said, voice low. Now we count the days without explosions. That's what joy has become. The shelter walls were covered in crayon drawings, each one a silent scream, a house without a roof, a mother crying, a son with no smile. These were the masterpieces of a generation robbed of its right to grow up. Trump said we were a faraway problem, Natalia said. But my son is not a problem. He is a child, and he is broken. In the countryside, grandmothers raised orphan toddlers while mothers dug trenches. In cities, fathers recorded bedtime stories over WhatsApp in case they didn't survive the next drone strike. And in every home, grief nested like a parasite, feeding on hope. Children bury their parents here, Ivan added, and sometimes the other way around. And still the world debates sanctions like it's a budget line. Psychologists warned of trauma so deep it might shape generations. But who listened? Western pundits argued whether supporting Ukraine was too expensive. As if lives had a ledger. As if children were receipts. Tell me, Mr. Trump, Natalia spat, how many luxury golf courses does it take to weigh against my son's fear of the dark? The world was watching, but too many watched through a screen, behind glass, beyond reach. Yet behind every statistic, every analyst's report, there was a mother shaking in silence, a child clutching a stuffed bear with one eye missing, a life that once knew peace. We cannot give them back their innocence, Vasil said, but we can damn well make sure they don't lose it in vain. In the frostbitten trenches outside Bakhmut, 20-year-olds held rifles in hands that once held guitars. Doctors performed surgeries by candlelight. Schoolteachers became medics. bakers turned soldiers. The line between civilian and combatant blurred into dust, grit, and blood. My name is Ole. I was a welder. Now I carry a rifle. Not because I want to kill, but because I refuse to kneel. They fought with homemade drones and scavenged parts. They wired GoPros to Molotov cocktails. They shot down billion-dollar Russian aircraft with grit, not gear. Ukraine's soldiers bled not just for territory, but for meaning, for proof that courage still counted in a world anesthetized by comfort. You think NATO uniforms make you brave? A female sniper growled into a walkie. Try defending your street in sneakers and a wool coat. In Mykolaiv, a 67-year-old grandmother threw a jar of pickled tomatoes at a Russian drone. It jammed the rotor. The drone crashed. She laughed, lit a cigarette, and walked away. Her name was Helena. She became legend. But while Ukraine gave blood, the West too often gave bureaucracy. While our boys died in frozen fields, arms companies raised their stock prices, Ivan muttered, holding up his cracked phone. Profits soared. Shareholders smiled. The market did better than our medics. Western CEOs toasted war bonuses in London, Berlin, and New York. Politicians issued statements full of sorrow but empty of substance. And behind closed doors, oil tycoons and tech conglomerates whispered, "Crisis is good for business." They all profited, Natalia said, while my neighbor died clutching his daughter in a basement that hadn't had power in 4 weeks. There is no market value for that kind of grief. And Trump? He called Putin a smart man. He called Zelensky ungrateful. He floated cutting aid altogether, demanding Ukraine investigate his political rivals in exchange for missiles, extortion wrapped in diplomacy. Do you know what it's like to die because of someone else's re-election strategy? Vasyl asked. We do. Still, Ukraine fought because surrender meant erasure, because the battlefield was not just a place, it was an idea, an act of defiance. Our soldiers wear second-hand boots and still outrun the enemy, Natalia said. We may be outgunned, but never outwilled. They fought while rich men traded blood for dividends, while some leaders posed beside flags, others stood beneath missiles. And through it all, the soul of Ukraine didn't bend, it blazed. This is our land, Ivan said. We will not lose it to cowards in tanks or cowards in suits. Treaties, declarations, press releases, they once meant something. Words inked with ceremony and wrapped in gravitas. But in Ukraine, they meant nothing. Not when tanks crossed borders and children dug graves for parents under tarpaulin and broken sky. We gave up our nuclear weapons for peace, Vasyl said, staring at a crumpled copy of the 1994 Budapest Memorandum. And in return we got speeches and silence. The promise was clear. Ukraine would surrender its nuclear arsenal, then the third largest in the world, in exchange for sovereignty and security. Russia signed, the United States signed, the United Kingdom signed. But promises, it turned out, had expiry dates. And when Putin struck, only Ukraine bled. Where were they? Natalia asked. Where was the ironclad protection? Where was the West when Russian tanks rolled through our wheat fields and our children vanished beneath rubble? There were words. So many words. We stand with Ukraine, they said. We are deeply concerned. They lit up landmarks in blue and yellow while letting Russian gas flow, letting oligarchs launder money in London real estate, letting disinformation rot public discourse from within. Trump called our fight a European problem, like freedom had borders, Ivan muttered. He looked at genocide and shrugged. He sold us out to stay in Putin's good graces. The same man who threatened to pull out of NATO, who withheld military aid unless Ukraine investigated his opponent, who praised autocrats and mocked allies. His legacy was not neutrality, it was complicity. And even after him, the betrayal didn't stop. The world moved on. Attention waned. Cameras turned elsewhere. The war, too long, too distant, too inconvenient, faded from headlines like a nightmare one refuses to remember. We buried the dead while they changed the channel, Natalia whispered. The promises were not just broken, they were never meant to hold. Ukraine learned that security could not be gifted. It had to be carved out with calloused hands and sleepless nights. We stood by the rules, Vasyl said. We did everything right, and still they let us drown. Yet in every breach there was resolve. In every betrayal, defiance. Ukraine would not forget the broken promises, but it would not be broken by them. They didn't save us, Natalia said, but we saved ourselves, and that they will never forget. Long after missiles silenced street musicians and tanks rolled across concert halls, the songs of Ukraine still rang through the valleys, through shattered windows and scorched earth. The occupiers came for land, but they also came for language, for spirit, for memory. They tried to erase us, Natalia said, holding up a hand-painted pisanka egg, the ancient symbol of rebirth, but we were never written in pencil. In the smoking ruins of Irpin, schoolchildren recited Taras Shevchenko's poems. In underground bunkers, choirs sang folk hymns through the echo of air raid sirens. Artists carved sunflowers into bombed buildings. Painters turned broken walls into murals of resistance. Ukraine did not just survive, it created. In the darkest days, Vasil whispered, we remembered who we were. The war was an attempt to erase Ukrainian identity, to reduce a sovereign people to a puppet state. Russia called the language illegitimate, called the culture fascist, called the people confused. But Ukraine was not confused. It was enraged and clear-eyed and immortal. My grandmother taught me to embroider in the Hutsul style, Natalia said. Now I teach my daughter between air raid sirens. That is how we win. Russian troops tore down Ukrainian signs. Ukraine raised them higher. They banned books. Ukraine read them aloud in defiance. They tried to rename cities. Ukraine etched its history deeper into stone and soul. Even in exile, identity thrived. In Warsaw cafes, Berlin shelters, and London train stations, displaced Ukrainians danced in traditional costumes. They played the bandura. They served borscht and told stories. They refused to disappear. Trump didn't know the difference between Kiev and Crimea, even said, but we know who we are. And no map, no tweet, no dictator can redraw the lines etched in our hearts. The war aimed to erase Ukraine from history. Instead, it carved Ukraine into legend. The blue and yellow flag no longer just fluttered, it blazed. It stood not for territory alone, but for memory, for poetry, for the stubborn fire of a people who would rather die than be silenced. We are more than our suffering, Natalia said. We are songs sung under siege. We are books burned and rewritten. We are every child who says Slava Ukraini before bed. Culture was not collateral, it was the front line. And on that line, Ukraine stood unshaken. The world once watched Ukraine with urgency. Explosions opened evening news. Analysts filled studios. Hashtags trended. For a moment, global attention felt like solidarity. But then, the next scandal came. The next celebrity trial. The next election cycle. And Ukraine, still bleeding, was pushed off screen. They said never again after Buchvasil muttered, but they meant until the next headline. The war was too long, too messy, too far, and worse, it challenged comfort. Western audiences flinched when truth got too close, when it showed the mangled stroller, the mother frozen in the snow. They called it trauma fatigue. Ukrainians called it abandonment. My son is still afraid of the dark, Natalia said. But the news says viewer discretion advised when we ask the world to see what he sees every night. Networks moved on. Politicians followed. Aid was debated like a tax issue. Stories were diluted, repackaged, sterilized. Balance became false equivalence. Russian lies got airtime under the guise of both sides. Truth became a footnote. Genocide became a discussion topic. And Trump? Ivan spat. He spent more time calling Zelensky weak than calling Putin out. He made our struggle about him because narcissism doesn't bleed. The betrayal wasn't just in silence. It was in the framing. Commentators questioned whether Ukraine could really win, as if resistance was a sporting event, as if survival needed a poll, as if freedom required better PR. They gaslit our pain, Natalia said. They turned our mourning into content, and when the clicks slowed down, they left. Meanwhile, Ukraine endured, not for an audience, not for applause, but because losing meant vanishing, and the world's short attention span was not a valid reason to die quietly. They see war fatigue, we see mass graves, Vasil said. Tell me, who's really tired? And still the betrayal stung. To be watched in horror is one thing. To be forgotten while still burning is another. We don't need their pity, Natalia whispered, but we damn well deserve their honesty. The cameras left. The headlines changed, but the war didn't end. The screams didn't stop. The betrayal didn't fade. And Ukraine? Ukraine kept standing, alone if it must. Justice cannot be an afterthought. It cannot wait for history books or quiet reconciliations written by men in warm rooms. For Ukraine, justice must be loud, unapologetic, immediate. It must call crimes by their names and name the criminals, no matter how rich, no matter how powerful. We buried neighbors in the playground, Natalia said. Don't tell me this is complicated. It's murder, and murderers must be tried. The images are etched in the eyes of the world. The tortured bodies in Bucha, the crater where a maternity ward once stood, the charred corpses pulled from a train station platform. These were not acts of war, they were acts of terror. Intentional, systematic, unforgivable. And yet, the international courts speak in slow motion. The architects of this horror still dine, still shake hands, still pose for state portraits. Putin signs decrees while mothers identify their children by dental records, Vasil said. Where's the justice in that? And behind him, shadowy enablers. Bankers who moved dirty money. Media outlets who echoed Russian lies. Politicians like Trump, who emboldened tyranny with flattery and greed. They may not have fired the missiles, but they lit the fuse. He sabotaged aid for political blackmail, even growled. That's not neutrality, that's complicity. Justice isn't just trials in The Hague, it's consequences. Sanctions that bite, assets seized, visas revoked, truth-telling without euphemism. Justice means holding leaders to the standards they expect of others. We don't want revenge, Natalia said. We want the world to mean what it says when it talks about human rights. Accountability means facing the truth that some in the West empowered this invasion, that silence was bought, that diplomacy was traded for spectacle, that a free nation was sacrificed on the altar of political gamesmanship. Ukraine will rebuild, Vasil said, but we demand more than bricks. We demand acknowledgement. We demand the world say, this happened and it was wrong. Justice is not optional. It is the only thing that gives meaning to the dead and dignity to the living. It is the only cure for the rot of betrayal. We have their names, Natalia said, and we will speak them until the world listens, until the guilty run out of places to hide. The world thought it could look away, that Ukraine's suffering was a regional issue, a distant quarrel, a fire that would burn out before reaching Western doors. But fires ignored become infernos, and as Ukraine stood its ground alone, the smoke drifted into every capital that chose silence over spine. They thought it wouldn't spread, Vasil said. They thought feeding the wolf would save them. Now they hear it howling at their own gates. The cost of indifference was not just Ukrainian lives. It was the corrosion of the very idea of order. Every missile not answered emboldened the next. Every lie unchallenged became doctrine. And every delay whispered an invitation to tyranny. Trump didn't just weaken NATO, Natalia said. He taught authoritarians that Western strength was negotiable, that morals were for sale if the right man wore a suit. And now the world reels. Cyber attacks on elections, assassinations on foreign soil, disinformation as common as morning headlines. China watches closely, Iran emboldened, North Korea louder, because weakness inspires imitation. Ukraine was the warning, Ivan said, and they ignored it. Now they reap what they sowed. The United Nations passed resolutions and watched them gather dust. The EU debated energy deals while begging tyrants for cheap gas. In the US, Trump's party flirted with isolationism, preferring grievance over global responsibility. All while Ukrainians died proving that the free world still had a pulse. We were not just fighting for us, Natalia said. We were the shield, and they let it crack. And with that crack came consequences. Weakened alliances, rise of extremism, global food insecurity, a refugee crisis, and most dangerously, doubt. Doubt that the West would act, doubt that values still mattered, doubt that liberty had any defenders left. If they fail us, they fail themselves, Vasil said, because what happens here doesn't stay here. Ukraine showed the world what courage looked like, what sacrifice meant, and what happens when bullies go unchecked. The question is no longer whether Ukraine deserves support. The question is whether the world deserves Ukraine. If democracy means anything, Natalia said, it must mean something when it's hardest to defend. The political consequences are here, not in some imagined future. They march with soldiers in foreign uniforms and rise in ballots cast by hands filled with hate. The only thing left to decide is whether this was the beginning of the world's fall or its last chance to stand. History will not ask how many statements were made. It will ask how many stood up when it mattered. And as Ukraine bleeds into its third year of resistance, Europe stands on a knife's edge, caught between remembering its past and repeating it. We begged them to believe us, Vasil said. We begged them to see that this wasn't just our war, but they were comfortable, and comfort deafens. Europe, the cradle of both civilization and genocide, has been here before. Appeasement disguised as diplomacy, delay dressed as caution. While families freeze in Odessa and cities fall brick by brick, some in Europe still hesitate, still weigh courage against commodity prices, still whisper, perhaps peace will come if we just wait. But Ukraine waited once, and tanks came. And America? Natalia asked. They once led, once stood for something. Now they argue over aid, while the free world trembles. The loss of American solidarity has left a vacuum filled with conspiracy, cowardice, and cruelty. What was once the beacon of liberty now flickers under the weight of division. A former president who praised tyrants and mocked allies may yet return to power, dragging with him a movement that views Ukraine not as a partner, but as a pawn. Trump turned our blood into a bargaining chip, Ivan said, and too many in his country cheered. Europe must choose now, not tomorrow, not after another Bucha, not after another Mariupol. It must choose between retreating into fractured self-interest or rising with moral clarity, because the next time may not be Ukraine. It may be Moldova, the Baltics, Poland. Cost of inaction, the cost of will be counted in capitals, not just casualties. We do not ask for pity, Natalia said. We ask for memory, for courage, for Europe to remember that its peace was built on the rubble of inaction. The flame of resistance still burns in Ukraine, but it flickers in the cold wind of global fatigue. It needs shelter, fuel, partnership, and belief. Not just from America, though its absence is deeply felt, but from the continent that knows too well the consequences of sleepwalking through evil. If we fall, Vasil said, it will not be because we were weak. It will be because the world refused to be strong. This is the last warning. Not from politicians or pundits, but from the people whose lives have paid for every delay. The price of inaction is not just Ukraine's destruction. It is the end of Europe as it believes itself to be.